Good afternoon. My name is Bill Barker, and I am the director of the Center for Faith and Inquiry at Gordon College. And it is truly my delight to welcome all of you to this afternoon CFI lecture. I'm pleased to say that our lecturer for today is Gordon College's own Professor Bruce Herman. Professor Herman, of course, for those of you who may not know him, is the Lothlorien Distinguished Chair in the Fine Arts and also the director of the Barrington Center for the Arts. And so we're just delighted to be able to offer you this lecture in the arts. Now, our lecture title for this afternoon, offered to us by Professor Herman, is Art and Voluntary Exile, Courage to Scout the Boundaries, which is great because that's part of this year's CFI theme. Every year, the Center for Faith and Inquiry has an annual theme that we try to explore with all of our lectures. And this year's theme for the 2020-2021 academic year is Courage in Crisis. Now, I just have to pause here for a moment because I know that so many of our students are listening in today. And I think this is a great moment to pause and reflect and offer some thanks for a Christian liberal arts education, which says that all truth is God's truth and that there are different perspectives from which we can learn and different pieces of the beauty and the majesty, the truth, the grace, the goodness of God that we can learn from all academic departments and divisions. And we're just very fortunate to have an expert in the fine arts and the material arts today in Professor Bruce Herman. Now, just before I introduce Professor Herman to you, I also would like you all to be aware that if any of you have questions that you would like to ask Professor Herman, we encourage that, and please submit those questions via the Q&A function on your screen on the Zoom call there, and we'll be able to answer those questions after the lecture during our question and answer session time. And now on to our lecturer. I just would like to briefly introduce you all to Professor Bruce Herman. As I said, many of you may know him, but let me just share with you a little bit about his background and then who my experience with Bruce Herman has been, what that's been. Bruce Herman completed both undergraduate and graduate fine arts degrees at Boston University School for the Arts. He studied under Philip Guston, James Weeks, David Aronson, Reed Kay, and Arthur Polonsky. Professor Herman lectures widely and has had his work published in many books, journals, and popular magazines. His artwork has been exhibited in more than 20 solo and 100 group exhibitions in 11 major cities, including Boston, New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and the Vatican. His work has been shown internationally, including in England, Italy, Canada, and Israel. Professor Herman's art is featured in many public and private collections, including the Vatican Museum of Modern Religious Art in Rome, the Cincinnati Museum of Fine Arts, De Cordova Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and the Hammer Museum, Grunwald Print Collection, Los Angeles. Now, this is just a tiny bit of Bruce Herman's resume, and you can find out more about his very storied and distinguished career on his website, which is bruceherman.com. However, before Bruce Herman begins, now that we've said something about his resume, I just want to share with you a couple thoughts about Bruce Herman, the person and the professor. I'm probably a little bit biased because many, many years ago, believe it or not, I was a student of Bruce Herman's right here at Gordon College, and I still remember some of his lectures, and I remember particular conversations and where I was as Bruce has shared about just the wonders of God and how we can understand him more greatly through art and the arts. And I'm grateful for those experiences. And I know that there are many, many students who feel the same way. Just scores of students that are grateful for his teaching and have been gripped by the knowledge and insight that he's had to share, as well as many art students that have been mentored under him. I also know Bruce Herman to be a gracious colleague and friend, a person of great faith in Christ, and also just a world-class artist whom we are very fortunate to have practicing here in our midst. So having said all of that, it's my distinct pleasure and delight to welcome Professor Bruce Herman for today's lecture. Bruce?
Well, thank you, Bill, Dr. Barker, and also Hannah, Craig, and Trudy Summers, the staff at the Center for Faith and Inquiry. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to share with you all today, and also to want to say hi to my student friends and faculty colleagues that might be joining us. My title is, as Dr. Barker said, is a little bit enigmatic, Art and Voluntary Exile. And I think what I'll do now is I'll just switch to my screen sharing so you can see that presentation, because I always have visuals attached here. So let's see if I can get that started. There we go. So a little bit about the title, Art and Voluntary Exile. So this phrase, voluntary exile, has its origins in the monastic tradition, and actually even earlier than the European monasteries. The Desert Fathers in the very early centuries of the Christian church, and actually all the way back to the Lord himself. The idea of going to a lonely place to pray is recorded in the Gospels. And it's very much at the heart of Christian spirituality, but it's also at the heart of art. And I'd like to explore that a little bit with you today. The thing that may be a bit of a surprise is the word exile. But maybe not so surprising if you look at this familiar scripture passage here. The Son of Man hath no place to lay his head, Jesus said. And of course, he said, the foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but I have nowhere to rest. And that was an indicator to his disciples, the ones who were going to follow him, that their lot may be thrown in with his, and live in a kind of voluntary exile. Let's see if this is not advancing. There we go. I'd like to start with this quote from Hugh of St. Victor. He is weak, for whom his native land remains sweet. He is strong, for whom every land is as a homeland. He is perfect, for whom the whole world is as a place of exile. This is from Hugh of St. Victor, a Christian saint and the founder of the School of Paris, from his defense of the liberal arts, the Didascalicon. And essentially what he's saying in this pithy quote, which I'll go over again in a moment, he's saying that by studying the liberal arts, and that would include the fine arts, something transforms in your life. Something transforms in your imagination, your intellect, your heart, that you leave home and you're no longer wedded to that comfort zone, that homeland. You learn to be at home anywhere, and then ultimately nowhere. So this place of exile, this is where learning, where knowledge becomes wisdom, because to follow Christ is the ultimate wisdom that this world has to offer. And where is Christ going? Well, he's going to a better country, a city whose architect and builder is God, and he's invited us to follow him there. So he's going into exile from the familiar places, the comfort zone of our world. But the question I want to place on the table at the very beginning here is, what relevance might beauty, the province of art, have to this life of following Jesus, of voluntary exile? And to begin with, I'd like to read a quote from Hans Urs von Balthasar. He says, "We no longer dare to believe in beauty, and we make of it a mere appearance in order the more easily to dispose of it. Our situation today shows that beauty demands for itself at least as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness. And she will not allow herself to be separated and banned from her two sisters without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance. We can be sure that whoever sneers at her name, as if she were the ornament of a bourgeois past, whether he admits it or not, can no longer pray, and soon will no longer be able to love. These three sisters, goodness, truth, and beauty, are inseparable." And of course, this is the introduction to his book, Seeing the Form It's volume 1 in a 7-volume set, a magisterial work called Toward a Theological Aesthetics, The Glory of the Lord. And what he develops in volume 1 is the sense of sight and how it can be hallowed for God, seeing the form. He's saying that beauty goes to the heart of God. We say God is good. Jesus said, I am the truth. I am the way and the life and the truth. We could also say, I believe, God is beauty. For from God's glory, from God's beauty, flow all of the beauty that we perceive in the creation. One thing we know from personal experience, all of us, is that truth is not always welcome. Genuine goodness is seldom circumscribed by niceness. And beauty is not always pretty. Let's examine that. So here we have an image from the Hubble Space Telescope of the Crab Nebula, which was a supernova that was first recorded in the first millennium in China. It's turned into a pulsar. It's 6,000 light years away. And what you're looking at is a massive burst of energy that continues to emit light and hot gases that would engulf our entire galaxy, let alone our solar system, would burn our own sun into a cinder. The violence of this explosive energy is also beautiful. Looking in the opposite direction to the subatomic, this photograph was taken of subatomic particles that were slowed down enough in a cloud chamber at 100 degrees below freezing. And what you see are semi-miraculous, to my eye, geometric patterns that were formed by the movement of subatomic particles. Now, I don't know if to your eye this is beautiful. To mine, it's as majestic to me as that supernova. Think about the power of the Colorado River that cut through all those layers of limestone to create the Grand Canyon. A violent rushing river, miles wide, cutting through solid rock. The force that was at play there, but it's beautiful. Or consider a hurricane seen here from the space station, the International Space Station, and it's absolutely stunning. But it's also incredibly powerful and scary, as is this thunder cloud. So it says in Psalm 50, the perfection of beauty God has shown. May our God come and not be silent. Fire devours before him, and a storm is violently raging around him. And yet we're in the same sentence, we hear about the perfection of beauty. So my point here, somewhat extended, is that we're dealing with the sublime. Beauty is a massively important and complex thing. It's not just prettiness. My next word that I'd like to throw on the table for our discussion is symbol. Now, we all know what a symbol is. It's a word or an image or a phrase that encapsulates many meanings and brings together a lot of disparate elements, often very complex, but are then constellated in this symbol. But what a lot of us may not know is that the original meaning of the word comes from the Greek symbolon. A symbol was originally a little tile about the size of your thumb, shown here on the screen, often carved in the shape of a handshake. And on the back, we see on the back of this one, it says Tessera Hospitalis, a tile of welcome. That's what a symbol was. It was a little tile of welcome that was given to a stranger before they crossed the threshold of your home to take supper with you, before they sat at your table. And before they crossed that threshold, this tile would be broken in half, snapped in two, and half would be given to the guest. And something like the following would have been said to them. Henceforth, you and anyone with whom you share this fragment of tile is welcome in my home and at my table, only the two pieces must be fitted perfectly together. It was a little bit like a token of password, of trust. So a symbol was literally just this little tile of welcome, this tessera hospitalis, that got broken in order for there to be hospitality. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. But here's a quote I'd like to read to you from Hans-Georg Gadamer, German philosopher. A symbol is that other fragment that has always been sought in order to complete and make whole our own fragmentary life. The meaning of art in this sense does not need to be tied to special social conditions. The experience of the beautiful in art is the invocation of a potentially whole and holy order of things, wherever it may be found. This comes from his essay, The Relevance of the Beautiful, in which he lays out three major foci, or focal points, for the discussion of beauty. One is play, which I'm going to come to towards the end of my talk. Another is symbol, and the third is festival, and I'll also be talking about that briefly. But symbol, just for a moment longer, think about this original meaning of a broken tile, a fragmented tile fitted back together perfectly to create the conditions of trust that allowed for hospitality, for someone to come across the threshold and into your dwelling and to sit at your table. He's extending this to the artistic process. So the artist makes the image, or writes the poem, or the piece of music, or the dance, and invites you, through a kind of artistic hospitality, to come and offer your piece of the tile, your piece of the equation, so that the two pieces fit together. Your heart, your imagination, your intellect, your receptive eye brought to the work of art so that it can be made whole. And I would go a little further and say art can be a means of accessing the farther reaches of the beautiful that we were talking about a few moments ago, the sublime, along with the paradoxical aspects of truth and the more challenging forms of the good, which we know can sometimes lead to sacrifice. And in the ultimate good of the cross, where Christ gave everything, that is the true picture of the good. And yet it's a conflicted picture. The cross is a terrible thing. Just as that supernova is a terrible thing, but also a beautiful thing, causing us to leave our comfort zone and hold up our part of the symbol. Another few thoughts about exile. This is a quote from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, spoken by the character Stephen Dedalus. I will tell you what I will do and what I will not do. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it calls itself my home, my fatherland, or my church. I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning. Now, I recommend that you read this book. It's a good story, and James Joyce is a masterful author. Stephen Dedalus is a complex creature, like you and I. And what he's saying as a young man is he cannot bring himself to be a hypocrite. He wants to tell the truth. He also wants to write poetry. He wants to do something meaningful, to make art. But he's not willing to do it from a half-hearted, subtly conflicted state. He wants to be unified in his mind and his heart. He's willing to go into exile in order to find that truth, to find that true beauty. So he's willing to become what I would call a scout, or a boundary scout, an outsider even, if necessary, to go into exile in order to find the truer, the more beautiful, the truly good, and not the half-truths that palm themselves off as the truth. Bruce Cockburn, Canadian songwriter, writes in his song, maybe the poet is gay, but he'll be heard anyway. Maybe the poet is drugged, but he won't stay under the rug. Maybe the voice of the Spirit, in which case you'd better hear it. Maybe he's a woman who can touch you where you're human. Male, female, slave or free, peaceful or disorderly. Maybe you and he will not agree, but you need him to show you new ways to see. Don't let the system fool you. All it wants to do is rule you. Pay attention to the poet. You need him, and you know it. So this concept of the artist as outsider, as exile, but also someone paradoxically welcoming you to come, listen to this poem, participate in this music, this festival, this gathering, this art gallery. The artist is extending courtesy or cortesia, which is elaborated at great length in this wonderful book by George Steiner, Real Presences, in which he develops a theory of literary texts, artistic works, music, as real presences, and the arts in general as a kind of a table, a feast to which all are welcomed. That courtesy, that letting down of one's guard that artists have to do in order to produce a genuine work of art is very costly. And we have lots of examples in art history and the history of the composers we know about, the poets we know about, who had damaged lives. They're like the Bruce Cockburn song, maybe the poet's gay, but he'll be heard anyway. There are places where the wounded come and they want to become a living sacrifice. They want to offer themselves. And that's essentially what Steiner is saying, is that the artist welcomes you to their place of vulnerability. They let down their guard and they invite you to do the same. Interestingly, C.S. Lewis, in his book An Experiment in Criticism, takes this even further than George Steiner. Steiner is not a religious man. Lewis, we know, was a deeply committed Christian and an apologist for the Christian faith. But in this book, you'd be surprised at what he invites us to consider. He's essentially saying in his book, Experiment in Criticism, that you cannot encounter the work of art unless you're willing to submit to it. You cannot really experience the fullness of a musical work or a poem unless you're willing to let down your guard. He says there are two ways of coming at texts. One is a defensive stance in which you come to the text with your expectations, and if your expectations are not met, you reject it. Or you don't actually ever encounter the text at all, but some imaginary version of it that is existing only in your own selfish expectations. But he argues this entire book is an argument in favor of taking the risk of being changed by a work of art, by a story, a poem, a painting, a musical work. And that's how you will enter into the festive element of art, the participatory element of art, the celebratory element of art, is by letting down your guard. But of course, there's a cost. There's a risk. You might be changed by it. And you might be changed in a way that you don't want to be changed. But that's what's behind also Hugh of St. Victor's words when he says, "He is weak for whom his native land remains sweet. He is strong for whom every land is a potential homeland, but he is perfect for whom the whole world is as a place of exile." Well, in order to get to that place, you have to be vulnerable. You have to risk being hurt. You have to risk being changed. Sometimes you'll see something happen where there's a loss involved. Well, I begin a project with drawings, many, many layers. We build up dozens of layers and then sometimes drastically edit in order to arrive at the image that seems to want to come into being, even at the expense of getting rid of months of work. Then I'll cut through wet paint to underlayers to try to reveal palimpsests of what was there before. I can be pretty brutal, almost unmaking the very thing I've been making. So as you can see, from that original commission for a large resurrection, I got a call after months working on it from the new dean of the Divinity School at Duke University. And she said, you know, there have been some changes since the dean who commissioned this piece began, and the room that it's going into is going to be undergo massive demolition, and we can't support the larger work any longer. Can you do something a lot smaller and maybe the imagery not quite so challenging? And I listened on the phone, and I said, thank you for your call. Let me give this some thought, and I'll be back in touch. And I prayed about it, and overnight came to the conclusion that this was not just a failure of nerve on their part, but it was actually the Lord's doing, and decided to embrace the loss and the change and go ahead and move forward with this new concept. And this is what I ended up painting, a 5-panel painting that deals with the 4 classic medieval elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and the mysterious 5th element of the quintessence, as what it was called, which is where we get the word quintessence, was the 5th essence. 5 panels. The bottommost panel is time before time, roots of the tree in Eden, the fall of Adam. The element is earth. Of course, the Hebrew word for earth, Adamah, is the name of Adam, a man of earth, a man made from earth, from clay. It's also a place of loss, and as you see, the skull there is often depicted at the cross, at the foot of the cross. It was where death was introduced into the creation, and if you look closely, you can see a snake-like form in there and a broken arch. The middle 2 panels, on either side of the last panel, which is down the middle, 2 and 3 are the time of the cross. On the horizontal, the broken grid, our time, the tree is split in 2, it's riven. But it's also a time of redemption, time between times, and the cross as the tree. The elements are fire and water. So we have earth, air, and earth, fire, and water so far. The fourth panel is the topmost panel, a lunette, a semicircular panel with a sprout of a new growth, which also is like a fountain of life. It's the new heavens and the new earth. It's the time future. It's the time to come. And the element is air. So earth, air, fire, and water. And then this mysterious fifth element. And the fifth panel is a thin strip with pure 23 karat gold that divides the two parts of the tree in half, splits the tree in half, and brings about new growth. It's the vertical of Christ's resurrection and ascension. It's his divine intervention, his kenosis or self-emptying. It's the descent of grace, God's presence as divine lightning strike, and also like sap rising in the new tree. And the element, the ether, they called it in the medieval mind, the fifth element, the quintessence, is the mysterious element that they believed held the entire cosmos together. So the entire cosmos, they believed, was made of earth, air, fire, and water, but held in perfect balance by this mysterious fifth element, which we know is a symbol of Christ. Because through him all things were made, and in him all things hold together. That's the final piece. And here's an installation view when it was installed in York Chapel at Duke University with its own little niche. Great honor to do that. Here's a poem about riven things by Christian Wyman. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. Stone and tree and sky, man who sings, sees and sings and wonders why. God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone, trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes, belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see, God goes, belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go, a part of what man knows, apart from what man knows. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made. I'm going to end today my formal remarks meditating for a moment on another major aspect of art, play.
When he's asleep, his brain goes off automatically.
Oh, well, which buttons are which, though?
Oh,
Can you tell me which ones?
this one is his mouth that makes his brain turn on.
Okay.
That's the
But what
one.
about the other buttons?
Oh, this one has a radio that goes through him out into the world, so I can hear him wherever I go.
Oh.
With Mama in the car.
Oh, even if he's back here?
Uh-huh.
That's great. Can you tell me what any of the other buttons are?
This one is a button that turns on the spotlight.
Oh, okay. And what does he need the spotlight for?
To see if Mama's coming home in the dark. I added it.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Yeah, you gotta keep track of your mother, right?
Yeah. So if she comes up the driveway, robot teapot, because I press this button and this button controls to this one and to this one, so I can hear, he can hear.
These are just a couple of Tristan's robots, Robot Teapot and his friend Buddy. My little 4-year-old grandson and his mommy and his daddy have come to live with us ever since the COVID virus began in New York City. My daughter Sarah and her husband have been in New York City for about 20 years when the COVID virus hit, and they got sick and came home, and I built a separate apartment in our house for them where they could quarantine for what ended up being about 35 days. And then that was back in late March. And by early May, we were together again. And Tristan, they've lived with us ever since, so almost a year now. And I get to spend time with him every morning. I'm the first one up. I get up at 5 a.m. and have my devotional time and do my reading and writing. And then Tristan always wakes up every single day at 6:30 a.m. and comes down and sits on my lap in my office. And then when he's ready, we get up and we go make something. He always wants to make something. That spirit of play is at the heart of God. It is not just a childish thing. It's the heart of creativity. The very source is God's play. And I would add, part of that play is always making things up, and yet also following the rules. This is a paradox, because you think of improvisation as being free play and rules as being ordered and possibly even rigid. But think about the play. If you're an actor, you know, in order to appear natural on stage, the actors have to rehearse and rehearse and rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. There are rules. There is order. There's a lot of planning and a lot of work to produce the play. Final thought I want to leave with you here is that this whole concept of exile that I've been elaborating has undergirding it this deep and profound theological reality of grace. And we are invited by grace to God's table. Christ himself is the symbol that is broken. Here is my body broken for you. He invites us across the threshold into his dwelling, to sit at his table. His hospitality is the ultimate hospitality, and all art flows from that. At home, nowhere and anywhere, the artist, disciple, is complete, for whom the whole world is a place of play, broken symbols, beauty, hospitality, and simultaneous exile. The Son of Man hath no place to lay his head. Yet the kingdom of God is in your midst. Thank you.
Bruce, thank you so very, very much. And I just want to say to all of our viewers, and I know so many of our students watching today, a number of our honors students that are here today listening. And I just want to say, I hope that everyone was able to appreciate your vulnerability as the artist. You talked about the artist, welcoming us into their vulnerability. And I believe that's what you've done today. And that is a real privilege. And it's something beautiful. And I would encourage our students just to have a spirit of gratitude about the wonder and the beauty of what Bruce Herman has done in sort of demonstrating to us his thought process and the work process and the creativity and all of the powerful concepts that are involved in actually producing artwork. It was spectacular. And then simply the joy of a grandson being there. So I have a wealth of my own questions, but I see some are coming in, and maybe I'll save those for you and I later. But I just want to ask a question or two that are coming in for you, Bruce. And this one is from one of our staff members who's with us here today.
Okay.
And she asked, is there a piece of art that comes to mind that you encountered which transformed you?
Oh my. I mean, I think that's a similar question to one I'm often asked, which is, who are the artists who've most influenced you. And I actually, the word influence is one that I don't accept. I believe that all art is a form of hospitality. All art is a form of conversation, a kind of welcome into dialogue. The great thing about art is you being dead is not a disqualification from being part of that conversation. So it's a lot of artists from hundreds of years ago that I'm in conversation with all the time in my studio. Probably if I had, asking me who my favorite artist is, or the artist that's most transformed me, or the art that's most transformed me, would be like asking what my favorite color is, which I'm not willing to choose. I want all of the colors. But I say that, hundreds of artists and hundreds of works of art have had a huge impact on me. I'll share one story that's a really brief story, but may get to the heart of why I reject the idea of influence. I was a real skeptic of abstract art when I was in art school. And I thought it's too easy. If the person doesn't know how to draw the human figure or doesn't know how to draw a convincing landscape, it can't be serious art. And I was pretty convinced that I was right. And one particular artist that I found out about was Mark Rothko, a 20th century Jewish artist who painted large paintings the size of a human body and bigger, but they were just fields of color. No subject matter, no image really, just fields of color. And I thought, can anything be more stupid than that? Well, I happened to go to a major museum that had a whole room full of Mark Rothko paintings. And I had the whole room to myself. I walked in and, totally taken off guard, started weeping in front of these paintings. And all they were large rectangles of certain color vibrations. And it hit me. And it unleashed tears. And I was deeply moved just by color. And that was kind of a conversion experience of sorts when it comes to modern art. I began to realize there's a lot more to this than you'd think. The kind of care that went into his wrestling with the vibration of color. Think about it. In God's universe, color is hugely important. So I would just say that's one example, but I could give you hundreds of examples of art that has had a huge impact on me. And it also changed my understanding of my own work and what I needed to do as a painter.
Thank you, Bruce. I just want to encourage all of our listeners, if you do have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we'd love to get to your questions. I have another question here for you, Bruce, and that is, in the course of your lecture, you said that beauty was massive and complex and not just prettiness. And just prior to that, you had mentioned the term sublime. And of course, there's something similar C.S. Lewis says in his work, The Abolition of Man. I'm just wondering, in light of that, as an artist, can you offer us your personal definition, or what you would say a definition of beauty is? And why does that matter for the Christian?
Well, thanks, Bill. First of all, I need to say that I'm skeptical in general about propositional limits being placed on transcendent metaphysical realities. It's arrogant for us as human beings to try to place limits, whether they be measurements or definitions, on something as important as truth. That's not to say that we can't find truth in our measuring and in our defining and our philosophical speculation about reality. But reality is infinitely more profound and rich than we can possibly get at with words and numbers and human culture. I feel that way about beauty. I feel that beauty is a profound metaphysical reality that is manifest everywhere, and we can encounter it very simply any day of the week, any moment of any day. I don't think we can get to the bottom of it. I think it's fathomless and infinite, like truth and like goodness in their pure form in God. That being said, I think we can talk about some of the features of beauty. I mean, one of the things we all love about the natural world is the intricacy and the harmonies of shape relationships, of textures, of color. I mean, one of the things that happened to me after looking at those Mark Rothko paintings is I started seeing color in a different light. I started understanding that it had emotional content, that it had psychological and even spiritual meanings embedded in it. Not things that can be put into words. And in fact, that's the thing about the visual arts and about music, is that where words end is where music begins. Where words end is where art begins. And even poetry. Poetry, in a way, is where words end. It's the poet pushes words to the breaking point, where they spill, as it were, new meaning. So beauty is it's a metaphysical, transcendent reality.
Thank you, Bruce. And this is just a little bit lighter spirited question.
Yeah.
One of our viewers wants to know what the black figure and maybe the skeleton behind you are all about there. So if you could comment maybe a little bit on your workspace there in your workshop.
Yeah, I'm happy to. This angel figure was carved by a dear friend of mine, who's the man who introduced me to my wife nearly a half a century ago now. We've been married 47 years, and David Bastian is his name. He's a sculptor who I lived with. He was my roommate for about a year or two. He's also the one who introduced me to one of the most influential thinkers in my life, and that's Martin Buber, the Jewish thinker. But David carved that angel for us out of chestnut, beautiful wood. And that was, I'd say that was probably in the early 1980s that he gave us the angel figure. And that was always in our home, hung over our fireplace. And then in 1997, our house was struck by lightning and burned down. And all of my art that was in the house burned with it, and all of my books, thousands of books. And David's angel got turned practically to charcoal there, and it was in pieces on the floor. When I was able to go into the house before the house was torn down to salvage a few things, I salvaged the pieces. And during the COVID isolation, social distancing time last spring, when I had some time on my hands, I painstakingly put it back together again. It's still black as night, but it's beautiful in its own kind of dramatic way. The skeleton has a story attached to it too, which is kind of fun and interesting. Back in the early days of my time at Gordon, in the late 1980s, I started in 1984 teaching at Gordon. In the late 80s, the physical plant was located across Grapevine Road where the Bennett Center is now. It was just a barn. It was a big old barn. And they had all their equipment in it, and they had their office in the barn on the second floor. And I had to go in to ask for some help on a project that I was working on. So I went upstairs, and there was a skeleton hanging on the wall, and it had a winter cap and a scarf around its neck. And I said, "What is that skeleton doing here?" And the head of physical plant was there, Paul Helgeson, and he said, "Well, sorry, it's probably disrespectful to have the winter cap and the scarf on it, but we found that skeleton. It's an anatomical skeleton. It's a real human skeleton. But we found it in a dumpster behind the science building. And we just couldn't bring ourselves to throw it out. Would you like to have it?" And I said, "Yes, of course." I mean, especially figurative artists like myself, need to be able to know anatomy. And I took artist anatomy in art college. But to have a real human skeleton is a wonderful aid in drawing. But it's also something I wanted to show respect for the skeleton. And I've actually, believe it or not, I've written into my will that when I pass away, to have the skeleton buried and some words spoken over the skeleton of blessing, because we had no idea who that was. We know it was a female, and a lot of the anatomical skeletons that were used in science labs and in anatomy labs in the earlier part of the 20th century, up until actually pretty much late 20th century, a lot of the actual human skeletons that were used for those purposes were from India. For very, very poor people would mortgage their bones in order to feed their families. And of course, for a Hindu, there's an element of real sacrifice there, because you don't want your bone. I mean, it's a sacrilege in some ways, as it would be for many other religions, to have your bones not be interred. So I've tried to show respect to this beautiful work of art made by none other than the Lord himself. And I hope someday to give it a proper burial. But in the meantime, it keeps me company in my studio and is a real help.
Bruce, I thank you so much for those stories on both counts. I mean, I think the common thread that runs through them is your deep respect for not just art and beauty, but for the sacredness of the things that God does through tragedy, as in the case with the profound loss, and yet your ability to, in a sense, truly redeem that work. And then on the other hand, just for the image of God, the Imago Dei. So I thank you for both those. I want to pivot to another question based on your lecture, which is, you mentioned Hugh of St. Victor, who is someone I deeply love, and I don't hear a lot of people referencing today, which is a shame, because I think he probably in his writings points to a lot of the relevance of the Christian liberal arts and exactly why we need them so desperately today. And in terms of his integrative philosophy, may also point to how to make the residential liberal arts financially sustainable. So believe it or not, Hugh of St. Victor as perhaps a guide for many of the headwinds against the Christian liberal arts today. Having said that, he argued often that St. Augustine had said art and philosophy are wonderful because they serve theology. And yet here you are as an artist, and I hear the different ways. I mean, you're reading Hugh of St. Victor, you're quoting poetry and German philosophers. How has in your life story, how has philosophy and theology shaped you as servants of art that somehow then points us back to the Imago Dei? I mean, what does that process look like? How I guess I typically don't think of you saying, well, I went to the Boston, University School of the Arts and we immersed ourselves in philosophy and theology to get to this point. So can you just share, like, how were you shaped? How did you get to this point where all this is sort of fused together?
Oh gosh, well, that's kind of my life story, I suppose. I mean, my grandparents used to tease me when I was little and say, "Brucey, you're the little philosopher." So even when I was a little kid, I was asking hard existential questions. That was just, I guess, and I don't know, this may be true of lots of artists, that we are always a little bit of the outsider, always asking hard questions. For me, those first level questions: why are we here? What's gone wrong? Who are we? Where are we going? What is the meaning of all this? Why is there suffering? These are questions that have plagued me my whole life, and I chose not to go in the direction of becoming a professional philosopher or theologian, but I've been reading theology and philosophy pretty much all my life, and reading widely, not just Christian thought. I was, for 15 years, deeply involved in Eastern philosophy, and I learned a lot. There's a lot of wisdom in the East. There are some problems too, and so eventually I had to distance myself from certain aspects of my earlier philosophical leanings, and when I really committed my life to Christ when I was 30 years old. But yeah, it's about my whole pilgrimage. So to answer your question, Bill, I'd have to tell you my life story. I guess what I would say is that for me, it's all of a piece: theology, philosophy, art, poetry. They're all a seamless fabric for me. And what does that tapestry look like? It looks like a life. Yeah, I could go further with that, but I think that's probably the most honest I can be, is that it's the fabric of my life.
Well, we might have to schedule that for a second lecture at some point here for our students to get the Bruce Herman life story. I appreciate the answer. I'm going to have you draw on that seamless fabric of art and philosophy and theology, because we have a student that has actually sent a question in via email, which I'm just going to read to you here.
Okay.
And our student says, what does it mean to say that beauty demands as much courage as truth and goodness?
Yeah, the full quote is, beauty demands as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness. And I think what if you get a chance someday, it's not an easy book to read. The Seeing the Form, volume 1 of the Theological Aesthetics of Hans Urs von Balthasar, but that book is essentially an unpacking of that very statement. So I'll do my best in a brief response to that really interesting and important question. I tried in my lecture to show that beauty is complex and rich and multi-layered, is not just contained in things that we find pretty or pleasing. It's actually more awesome than that. It's more, and by awesome, I mean literally awesome, awe-inspiring. So, I mean, to be committed to beauty, the way one is committed to goodness and to truth, requires a life work. I mean, I thought about it the other day. I was talking to someone and I realized I have been painting in a disciplined way, not as a Sunday painter or amateur, but as a disciplined professional artist for a half a century now. I started when I was 18. I just turned 68. And I'm not being modest or trying to be humble when I say this. I feel like I'm just getting started. A half a century is a start to explore the profound reality of beauty. But that's a life work. I mean, you know, and I don't want to diminish that 50-year commitment. And, you know, however many days or hours or years the Lord has for me left, I intend to continue trying to explore and to deepen my grasp, my understanding, my submission to beauty, because I think that's what you need to do. You need to submit to the truth. You need to submit to goodness. You need to submit to beauty. The beauty that comes from God, the glory of God, is possibly the most profound thing that we can ever contemplate. And I believe that glory of God is beauty. I could go further with that, but I hope that at least begins to get at that question about what kind of courage does it take. It takes the courage to say yes to the sacrifice of a life work, of committed service, as musicians say, service to the muse, which is where we get the word music. The muse, in my case, is beauty.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm going to read one of the questions here out of our Q&A in the online chat. For those who aren't in art studios daily, do you have any recommendations or advice for where we can look for and also create some beauty?
Oh, well, I think anybody can. I honestly believe, you know, the old St. Augustine, our hearts were made for God and are restless until we rest in him. I like to take that and twist it ever so slightly to say we were made by a maker to be makers. And our hearts are restless until we make something beautiful. But that's something that you make. Could be a loaf of bread. It could be a Valentine. It could be a handwritten letter. It could be a piece of music that you play. But you have to make something. I think you will be restless unless you're making something. On a more concrete and practical level, if you don't have access to art materials, you know, and studios and like this beautiful space that I get to work in, one of the great spaces that you can put in your back pocket is a sketchbook. And even if you don't know how to draw well, if you try to draw anything in your sketchbook, it will slow you down so that you really have to pay close attention. And you'd be surprised if you do slow down and you're willing to spend the 3 hours that it takes to draw a flower, for example. Imagine sitting and actually looking at a flower carefully for 3 hours. How often have you ever done that in your life? Probably never, right? Unless you're an artist who has tried to paint a flower. So you can carry a sketchbook in your back pocket and a pencil or a crayon or a marking pen. You can pull stuff out of the top of your head, or you can look. I highly recommend that everybody learn how to draw, just like I think everybody should learn how to read and write. Drawing is a basic skill that can be learned. There are lots of good books out there. Anyone who's interested, email me and I'll send you a whole bibliography of possible how-to books. I mean, the thing is about drawing is it causes you to slow down enough that you actually look. A lot of the time, we are not actually looking at our world. We're looking past it. Or we're only looking at it fast enough so that we can identify whatever it is that we're looking at. And once we have a word or a formula for it, we stop looking at it. We codify it into language. But drawing reverses that process. It makes you slow down and look. And if you're willing to slow down and look, you will be rewarded. And I think anybody can do that. You don't have to be a great artist to keep a sketchbook.
Thank you, Bruce. I just, I'm beaming this entire lecture and Q&A. I'm so grateful for your insights. And I see that our group of freshman honors students are as well. For our listeners and for you to be aware, our freshman honor students, part of the Global Honors Institute, because as freshmen they have faced the challenges of COVID, have fused the name of the Global Honors Institute with COVID to refer to themselves jointly as the Glovids. And this group of very courageous, enduring, just character-driven students is asking you a question jointly. They would like to know, how does one begin to let his or her guard down when experiencing art? And they also say, P.S. Tristan is so cute and creative.
who was with referring? I missed that last bit.
Tristan. They said,
oh,
Tristan. Yeah. Tristan is so cute and creative. They
yeah, oh my gosh, I learned so much from my grandchildren. I have 5 grandchildren, by the way. Tristan is the youngest. Yeah. How do you let down your guard? Well, I think the starting point is what I was just talking about with drawing, and that is slowing down enough to actually spend time with a work of art. To listen to a Beethoven sonata, piano sonata, you need a good 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And to listen to it carefully, you have to listen to it multiple times. So to let down your guard, to encounter Beethoven's music, you can't just give it a breezy once over or put it on as background music while you're doing something else. To truly encounter the work of art, you have to give yourself to it. You have to submit, as C.S. Lewis says in that book I mentioned, Experiment in Criticism, which I highly recommend for honors students. It's not an easy book to read. It's not like his popular essays. It's a scholarly essay, but it's really worth reading. And essentially that's what that book is about, is how to let down your guard, how to submit to the text. He's mostly approaching the standpoint of reading and literature. That's what the book is about. But interestingly, the opening chapter is about art. He uses art as a kind of metaphor, the visual art that is, as a metaphor for how to approach the text. I could probably, it's a beautiful and important question. How do you let down your guard to a work of art? I think probably to answer that question, I'd have to write a whole syllabus for you. But I think you can start by carrying around that sketchbook I mentioned. I'll tell you a little story quickly here, and I know we're running out of time. I carry a sketchbook whenever I go to a museum, and it slows me way down. One day I was at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I had my sketchbook out, and I was looking at a painting by Velázquez, Diego Velázquez. It's the Supper at Emmaus. A wonderful painting, by the way. And I was studying this painting carefully with my pencil, basically drawing it so that it would force me to really look carefully at the painting. To do even a sketchy rendering of that painting took me about an hour plus. And I'm a trained artist. So, but as I was doing the drawing there, several waves of Japanese school children who were visiting New York in a tour came through the gallery that this particular painting was in with a bunch of other great masterpieces. And I was sitting on the bench drawing, and they came in and they gathered around me, looking over, putting their chin on my shoulder and like leaning against me and looking in my drawing and just studying what I was doing. It was just wonderful. So if you ever go to a museum, get out your sketchbook and you're in for a treat. If nothing else, you'll spend some time carefully looking at something that's worth looking at. The poet Rilke once said, "The work of art speaks to you and it says, you must change your life." Look carefully and you will be changed.
Well, Professor Bruce Herman, we thank you so much for this time you've given us as you tell that wonderful story there. And we hear from our students. You can tell your grandson, Tristan, that the entire Gordon community is awaiting the day, maybe sooner rather than later, with his creations, that we see an exhibition at the Barrington Center for the Arts. But no, truly, I thank you not only because this was engaging, which is always wonderful for us to have a presentation was engaging, but much more importantly, that it was thought provoking, that it had the potential, if we allow it to be formative, and most of all, I even dare say, really sacred. Just a real Christocentric nature to what you've offered, and led by the Spirit, and typical of your graciousness. And so, I truly thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for joining us.
Yep.
This does conclude our lecture and our time together, and we hope to see you again at the next Center for Faith and Inquiry lecture. Thank you all so much.
Good night.